So I've noticed this thing among woodworkers that I like to call woodworker tunnel vision, which is this habit woodworkers have of only wanting to ever work with wood and not wanting to know anything about metal or plastics or synthetic materials. I even know woodworkers that don't want to think about using plywood or MDF. They're like, no, solid woods only. I only work with solid hardwoods. I'm like, okay. You know, and I get it, I'm primarily a woodworker, but it's really useful to just be able to work with whatever material is going to get you the best results. I think the other part of it's probably just fear. Just the feeling of, oh, well, if I wanted to do metal work, I'd have to learn a whole bunch of new techniques. And that's not true. It's really similar. You're measuring and marking, and you're cutting, and then you're doing some sort of joinery. So it's really not that different. And then some people might not want to invest in the tools, but, you know, I do some welding and some metal work, and honestly, the tools, they're not that bad. You know, and some woodworkers could be thinking, well, you know, maybe I'd get into metal work if I didn't have to buy, like, a lot of stuff. So, you know, maybe if there was one tool that would do cutting, grinding, shaping, sanding, de-burring, paint removal, and rust removal. If I could buy one tool that would do all that stuff, maybe I would get into metalworking. Well, there is one tool that does all that stuff. It's called an angle grinder. So, the angle grinder is really kind of amazing because of all the stuff that it does. It has 7 or 8 different functions depending on which attachments you own, and you can even use it to work with stone and masonry. There's attachments for that. There's even stuff that'll let you carve wood with the angle grinder. So if we're just talking about metal, if you have an angle grinder and a welder, you can make a huge array of stuff out of steel. And welders are cheaper and easier to use than they've ever been in history. So if you want to get into metalworking, this is a great place to start. The tool itself is really simple. It's just a motor, a transmission to turn the rotation at a 90-degree angle, thus angle grinder. It's got an arbor that you can put tools on. It's got a tool guard on it. Don't remove the guard. And it's got a handle that you can put on either side, which is convenient. And then there's a huge array of accessories that you can buy for your angle grinder. Just to start out with, I would recommend that you get some cutting discs, a grinding wheel, a flap disc sander, and a cup wire wheel. Just those 4 things will let you do pretty much anything you would want to do with steel or iron. And they're not very expensive. A lot of times you can buy all of them as like an accessory kit. To make this as easy as possible, let's just go through all of the common attachments as if we were doing an actual project. Now, most projects with steel are going to start with either paint removal or rust removal. And the perfect tool for that is the wire cup wheel. It's a lot like the wire wheel that you would put on a bench grinder, but it's a much more robust design. The wires themselves are a lot thicker and they're twisted together into these big bunches. And this wheel is also assembled much more strongly than those are. And the reason for that is that the rotation here on an angle grinder is usually quite a bit faster than a bench grinder. So, for instance, my bench grinder spins at 1750 RPMs. This wire cup wheel here is rated for a maximum rotation of 14,000 RPMs. And that's really important because you can take a wire wheel from a bench grinder and you can get it onto an angle grinder. They'll usually fit, but that's a terrible idea because all those little bristles, when they get up to 14,000 RPMs, they're going to start flinging off like tiny steel spears. And they're going to embed in everything, including your eyeballs. So don't do that. Get the proper thing and it'll save you. This wire cup on an angle grinder is a monster. It will take off rust, it'll take off paint, it'll get rid of stains, and really everything else that you need to do. It's an incredibly aggressive metal cleaning device. So here I've got a piece of angle iron that I'm going to be working with. It's really rusted. I found it by the side of the road, and I'm taking all that rust off with the angle grinder. It's going really quickly, and it's leaving a good finish on the steel. Once we've got our steel prepped by removing rust, old paint and getting a clean surface, the next thing we typically want to do is cut it. And the thing that we need for that is called a cutoff disc. It's also called a zip disc. It's a very thin disc made out of abrasive material with a matrix of fibers inside to keep everything together. And these are very aggressive cutting tools. They'll cut through almost anything, including hardened steels like tool steels. There's some really important safety considerations with these. They're probably the most dangerous thing you can use with an angle grinder, because when these discs wear out, they tend to shatter. And if they're spinning when they shatter, they just fly off in all directions with this awful, like, shrapnel everywhere. It's terrible. I wear safety glasses and a respirator when I'm using the angle grinder, so my face is pretty well protected. I also never take the guard off, so I know that if one of these splits apart on me, it's going to be contained by that guard. You also want to just pay attention to how worn out these are getting. These are cheap and they're disposable. They're not meant to be a long-term accessory. When they start getting worn around the edges, when you start seeing the fibers that hold the thing together poking through, it's time to throw one of these away and get a new one. Also, you only ever use these cutoff discs on the edge. They work as grinders. You can grind something down with the face, but they're not meant for that, and they're much more likely to shatter if you do that. So the temptation is to finish cutting something and then just turn this on its side and do a little bit of grinding. Don't do that. It's very dangerous. Switch tools and use the grinder. What you want to do is start off by lightly scoring the cut with the edge of your cutoff disc. And what you're doing is making a channel along your line. If you get the first couple of scoring cuts off and they're not right, don't worry about it. Just go back and be very careful about getting right on the line. By making a channel to start with, you're going to be creating a guide in the material that's going to keep your zip disc in the cut the entire time. Once you've practiced this technique a little bit, you'll be really surprised at how well you can get a very clean and even and straight cut using a zip disc. Once we're done making our cuts in the steel, the zip disc is going to leave a very ragged surface with a lot of burrs. So the next priority is going to be to clean up and de-burr those edges. It's going to make them safer, and it's also going to make assembly a lot easier and more precise. Now this is what we want to use the grinder for. And that's why it's called an angle grinder, because the thing you do with it most often is grind stuff. It's very easy to use one of these. You use light passes and light pressure on the work. Let the grinder itself do the work. These discs last a lot longer than zip discs, but they do wear out eventually, so make sure you replace them from time to time. They also get loaded up sometimes, depending on what material you're working with. So for instance, you really shouldn't use these on aluminum. They'll get loaded right away and they'll stop working. So you can move all around your cut, and you can do the face of the cut with the grinder, and that'll take off all the burrs and rough edges and get it ready for assembly. And unlike the zip discs, you can use any part of the grinding wheel that you want to. So go ahead and use the edge to get into tight spots, and use the face to do lines and larger surfaces. The grinding disc is also useful for general shaping tasks. So if you have a corner and you need to make it rounded, or if you need to create a slope or another angle, sometimes the grinder is the best way to do that. It can let you make curves and more organic shapes than you could make with the zip disc, and it's pretty quick. The other thing the grinder is good for is dealing with welds. Even if you're not welding, if you're using scrounged steel, you're going to come up against old welds a lot of the time. And those are very hard, and they can make the steel lumpy and sort of difficult to work with. So you want to grind those off. Here's a piece of steel that I put some practice welds on a couple years ago, and I'm just going to use the grinder to take those off. I have the grinder up on its edge, and I'm just using the edge of the wheel to slowly work back and forth and get down to smooth, bare metal again. It only takes a second, and the weld is gone like it was never even there. The grinding disc is going to take off all the burrs and is going to smooth out the rough edges. But because it's a grinder and it's a pretty coarse tool, it's still going to leave a relatively rough edge. So you need a more refined tool to create something that's going to be safe to handle and look good later on. And that's where the flap disc comes in. These are sanding discs. They're not too different than what you'd see on a wood sander, except that instead of being a continuous piece of sandpaper, these are actually arranged with little flaps of sandpaper that overlap each other. That helps it stay cool, be somewhat more aggressive, and also not get loaded down or wear out as easily. This is still a really aggressive tool, but less so than the grinder. And so what you can do is, after you've finished grinding, you can take the flap disc and take that over to your work and get a smoother and more refined edge. Now after you're done with this, if you still want it to be even smoother, there's no reason not to grab your palm sander, your random orbital sander, or even just some sandpaper in your hand and refine that surface even more. Steel works really well with the common sandpaper that you use for woodworking, and you can get a nice finish on it with just the sandpaper you've already got laying around. So now that we've got our parts cut, shaped, de-rusted, de-burred, and generally prepared, we're ready to assemble whatever we're making. So even if you don't have a welder, you could put your stuff together with nuts and bolts, or you could tap holes and use machine screws. There's lots of ways to join two pieces of metal together. And if you're interested in welding, you can buy an inexpensive stick welder or a cheap wire feed welder and just teach yourself. Before we're done, let me just talk about different brands of grinder for a minute. I have the DeWalt, and I really only bought it because it was sort of the least expensive mid-range tool that was out there. It was on sale, I paid less than $100 for it, and it's been fine. I have no complaints, it's worked really well. I think the most famous name in these is probably Makita. They make a bunch of different ones. They're a little bit more expensive, but they have the best reputation. And some of the lower-end companies like Ryobi or Rigid also make angle grinders. I haven't used those personally, but I'm sure for occasional use they'd be fine. I've also never used the Harbor Freight angle grinders, but what I hear about them is that for the price, they actually work really well. And for what they cost, you can afford to have a few of them sitting around, and instead of changing attachments all the time and constantly fiddling around with that stuff, you can just grab different grinders for different things. And that seems like a pretty good approach to me. So if you've given any thought to adding metalworking to your repertoire as a craftsperson, I hope this video will get you started. It's really easy and not very expensive to go buy an angle grinder, get a couple of attachments, and start doing metalwork. You don't even have to pay for the metal because scrap metal is just everywhere. You can find it by the side of the road, and it's perfectly good. It's where most of my metal comes from. So anyway, hope you learned something useful. Thanks for watching.